The greatest horror of Alcatraz wasn't the successful escapes. It was the sound of a life ending in the absolute silence of the system. I've spent years digging through the forgotten archives, the dusty official reports that promise a factual account, but always hide the human truth. My current investigation led me deep into the historical files of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, searching for anomalies, and I found one that wasn't a visual clue or a document, but a terrifying sound. My focus was drawn to an old reel-to-reel audio file labeled simply, Cell Block Demonitoring 1958. I knew immediately this was the core of the investigation. I sat in a cold, sterile archive room, far from the brutal cold of the bay, and carefully played the tape. For several minutes, the recording offered nothing but the expected, mundane drone of prison life, the clanging of distant cell doors, the low static of the monitoring equipment, the muffled shouts of guards on patrol, the predictable soundscape of a fortress designed to hold America's most dangerous men. Then, the background noise stopped mattering. Just past the 40-minute mark, the audio broke through the routine with a single, immediate horrifying sound, a high-pitched, absolute human scream cut off instantly, as if a hand had been clamped over the victim's mouth, or a knife had cut the source of the sound completely. The scream was raw, brief, and utterly terrifying, containing the full, distilled agony of a life being violently extinguished. But the true terror was the sound that followed. Following the scream, the background noise returned, but the prison system itself remained utterly silent. No alarm bells rang. No guard shouted an order. No other inmate reacted to the noise. The silence from the institution was total and immediate, confirming that the violence occurred, and that the violence was subsequently ignored. This audio evidence was the first terrifying piece of the puzzle I found. The fact that a sound of that magnitude, a clear violation of the prison's most fundamental rule, the rule of quiet order, could happen within the walls of America's maximum security fortress and never be officially reported, investigated, or explained was my immediate crisis. I knew then that I wasn't dealing with a simple death. I was dealing with a systemic cover-up, a deliberate act of institutional erasure. The prison wasn't just built to hold the inmates. It was built to contain its own secrets. The silence that followed the scream was the prison system's first and most damning rule. That sound could only have been contained by one place, the rock. After hearing the terrifying, strangled scream on the archival audio, I had to move past the immediate evidence of the death and analyze the environment that guaranteed the secret would remain buried. I knew that understanding the crime meant understanding the prison itself. Alcatraz was never meant to be a place of reform. It was a fortress of punishment, a brutal granite pillar rising from the freezing, shark-infested waters of the San Francisco Bay. This geographic isolation was the system's first and most effective psychological defense. The cold, relentless current served as the ultimate natural guard, guaranteeing that escape was physically impossible. But the true horror lay not in the walls or the water. It lay in the psychological engineering of the prison's operational philosophy. The rock's iron law, the iron law of Alcatraz, was designed for one purpose, absolute control, and the methodical destruction of individual identity. The daily routine was a relentless sequence of silence, enforced monotony, and total obedience. Personal property was minimal, conversation was restricted, and the noise that often defines human interaction was replaced by an unnatural, echoing stillness, a soundscape broken only by the cold clang of steel doors and the distant, constant sigh of the foghorns. I studied the old rules and regulations, realizing that every procedural detail was a tool of psychological torture. The inmates, already broken by years of incarceration, were subjected to an unyielding pressure that exacerbated mental illness, paranoia, and internal rage. Alcatraz was the final destination for America's most volatile criminals, but the system's rigidity ensured that it was a pressure cooker, designed to push even the strongest minds past the point of endurance. This extreme pressure, however, did not stop at the bars. It infected the entire compound, making the guards and staff deeply vulnerable as well. They were trapped on the island with the men they were paid to control, living under the constant, monotonous surveillance of the prison routine. The psychological stress of maintaining absolute authority over dangerous men in such confined, isolated quarters often led to burnout, sadism, and a casual disregard for institutional rules. The system, designed to eliminate chaos, became a breeding ground for systemic abuse and psychological cruelty. Minor personal disputes between guards could become major breaches of security, and the line between necessary discipline and outright torture often blurred, especially in the most isolated sections of the prison. The iron law was a shared psychological burden, crushing both the jailed and the jailers. I identified the true physical and psychological heart of the mystery in the prison's most dreaded section, D Block. This wing was reserved for the most recalcitrant inmates and contained the infamous hole, dark concrete isolation cells where sensory deprivation was the ultimate tool of control. This was where the prison's iron law was applied with its most brutal, dehumanizing efficiency. The hole was a place of total darkness and silence, designed to break the mind completely. If a guard wanted to exert private, untraceable force, or if an institutional error needed to be hidden, D Block was the designated location. The unchecked power held by the guards in this isolated section created the perfect environment for an institutional cover-up. The very systemic power designed to ensure order made the potential for untraceable violence absolute. I knew that if a scream was to go unheard, if an inmate was to vanish entirely without official record, it would happen here, protected by the system's own silence. The true horror of Alcatraz was its terrifying efficiency in destroying the human spirit. The system designed to contain men leaves no paper trail. That is the lie I was looking for. I had spent months inside the musty National Archives, filtering through thousands of pages of transfer orders, disciplinary reports, and personnel logs from Alcatraz. After hearing the scream on the audio tape, I was no longer searching for historical data. I was searching for a bureaucratic flaw, a file that was too clean, too simple, too easy to accept. The sheer brutality of the Rock's Iron Law, Part 2, guaranteed that if an inmate died or vanished under unusual circumstances, the prison system would immediately create a paper lie to cover the physical truth. The filing cabinet was their final fortress. Finally found the anomaly in a ledger detailing cell transfers from D Block in the late 1950s. The record referred to an inmate, let's call him Subject 34, a known disruptor, highly volatile, and frequently placed in isolation. The file indicated Subject 734 was transferred out of Alcatraz to another federal facility. But the dates were wrong. The signature authorizing the transfer was irregular, and crucially, the receiving facility had no record of his actual arrival. This clean, simple administrative error, a file too perfectly organized to be genuine, was the terrifying omen I had been hunting. It was the tangible proof that the institution had actively erased a life. The transfer file was the mechanism of the cover-up. It confirmed that Subject 734 had not escaped. He had vanished from within the most secure federal prison in the country. His disappearance was not a breakout. It was a systemic cleanup. I quickly pieced together his personal history. Subject 734 was known to cause immense noise and disturbances, fitting the profile of the man whose final scream was captured on the archived tape, Part 1. His file documented numerous stays in the hole, the dark, silent isolation cells, meaning he was intimately familiar with the system's most severe psychological tools. The system had a problem, a volatile inmate, and the paper trail suggested they found a final, permanent solution. My investigation became an immediate personal conflict. I was holding irrefutable evidence of an institutional murder, a complete administrative erasure. The logical connection was terrifying. Subject 734 was likely placed in D Block following his last disturbance, where, due to mistreatment or the extreme psychological pressure of isolation, he either died or was killed by the system itself. The scream on the tape was his final unheard protest. The transfer order was simply the lie used to close the cell door forever. The greatest terror of the system was its efficiency. It killed a man and then immediately covered its tracks with a few lines of typewritten text. The burden of holding this paper truth was immense. I knew that by confirming this anomaly, I was placing myself in direct opposition to the powerful, silent forces that orchestrated the cover-up in 1958. I was no longer an objective historian. I was an active witness against the system. The missing man file was not just a relic of the past. It was a current threat, confirming that the iron law of Alcatraz prioritized its reputation and its secrecy over the life of a single, unwanted prisoner. I realized that the core mystery wasn't finding the killer. It was surviving the truth I had just unearthed. Part 4. Rationalizing the disappearance. English. Finding the fake transfer file, the paper lie that documented Subject 734's non-existent journey out of Alcatraz, was easy. Fighting the massive institutional lie it represented was the hard part. The political and social imperative of the Rock's iron law was to remain untouchable, and the system immediately mobilized its defenses to rationalize the prisoner's vanishing. I knew the truth. Subject 734 had been erased from within. The official record, however, had a comforting, simple explanation. The inmate was either transferred due to disciplinary issues requiring special handling, or he committed suicide at sea after an undocumented escape attempt. This narrative was politically vital. Admitting to the public that a prisoner could vanish inside the most secure federal prison, possibly due to guard misconduct or institutional brutality, would have shattered the prison's carefully curated image of impregnable control. The system preferred the simpler narrative of the inmate's failure rather than the terrifying truth of the system's murder. My personal crisis began when I tried to use my factual evidence, the fraudulent transfer date and the lack of a receiving facility signature, to challenge the official conclusion. I was met not with counter-evidence but with calculated bureaucratic inertia. Files I needed suddenly went missing. Former staff members I contacted developed convenient memory loss, and key administrative records that should have verified the transfer were perpetually in transit or under review. I realized I was not fighting the initial cover-up of 1958. I was fighting its ongoing defense. The institution was actively maintaining the lie. The official rationalization relied entirely on the prison's location. If a body was missing, it was immediately attributed to the San Francisco Bay. The frigid water and powerful currents were the perfect silent alibi. The inmate was simply eaten by the current, ensuring the lack of corpus delicti remained consistent with the official narrative of an escape attempt or suicide. This geographical factor made the murder investigation unprovable and politically safe. I had to combat this simple lie with the complex facts I had personally uncovered. I argued that the protocol for transferring a high-security, volatile inmate like Subject 734 demanded extensive escort records and official confirmations, none of which existed. I pointed out that the disappearance occurred immediately following a known disciplinary incident, the very type of incident that often leads to abuses within the isolated D block. My insistence that the systemic psychological pressure, Part 2, had fractured and led to a homicide was dismissed as speculation. The evidence of the crime, the scream on the tape, Part 1, was merely a sound anomaly. I felt the weight of the institution pushing back, the subtle threats and warnings from archivists and historians hinting that I should drop the politically sensitive case. I was fighting the immense power of the status quo, the system's deep-seated need to preserve its reputation and avoid acknowledging the dark human reality behind its granite walls. The truth was simple. The institution would rather allow a man to become a historical footnote, transferred, than admit to a murder that occurred inside its most secure, silent fortress. The cover-up was robust, actively protected, and designed to wait out any challenge, relying on time and silence to ensure the fabricated reality became history. The official files lied. I knew the truth was not in the records that documented a non-existent transfer. It was locked inside the human memory of the men who worked on the Rock. My investigation shifted entirely from the dusty archives to the agonizing task of tracking down a retired guard, someone who had worked D-block in the late 1950s, someone fragile enough for the decades of silence to finally weigh them down. It took months of relentless effort, cold calls and promises of anonymity to finally locate a former officer, now a frail older man living quietly in the Midwest. This encounter was my final chance to penetrate the institutional silence, and the tension of that meeting was absolute. I met the guard in a quiet, anonymous cafe, far from the Bay Area where the institutional memory was strongest. His hands trembled as he held his coffee, and his eyes carried the haunted, distant look of someone who had spent decades living next to unimaginable brutality. He wouldn't look me in the eye. I didn't ask him about Subject 734 directly. I asked him about the rules, the unwritten laws of Alcatraz. I asked him about the Code of Silence. He spoke slowly, cryptically, confirming my worst fears. He explained that Alcatraz wasn't maintained by steel doors alone. It was maintained by a deeper psychological authority. He admitted that the rules were designed to break the inmates, but they also broke the guards, forcing them to participate in a system they knew was cruel. He detailed the systemic abuse, the purposeful psychological torment, and the sheer sadism that was allowed to flourish unchecked in the isolation of D Block. Then I brought up the screams. I played the archival audio, the chilling sound of Subject 734's final truncated agony, for the guard. His reaction was immediate and devastating. He didn't deny the sound. He didn't even pretend not to recognize it. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "You never tell anyone about the screams." That was the seventh rule. This was the strange dialogue I had been looking for. It wasn't a confession to murder, but it was irrefutable evidence of the cover-up. The seventh rule was not written on any institutional document. It was the chilling, unwritten law of the rock, the code of silence enforced by the guards themselves. The rule proved that the institutional atmosphere was so brutal that screams were a known, predictable part of the environment, and the system had been conditioned to ignore them. The violation wasn't the scream. The violation was the man who broke the rule by making the sound. The guard confirmed that the ultimate psychological terror was the knowledge that a prisoner could be tortured or could die inside the prison's most secure unit, and the system, the guards, the doctors, the wardens would simply erase the incident to maintain the prison's reputation. His cryptic testimony affirmed the entire procedural chain of the cover-up, the initial brutality, the unheard final cry, the institutional failure to report, and the creation of the fraudulent transfer file I had found. Part 3. I realized the true killer was the pervasive system of silence itself, and that the guards' haunted words were more truthful and damning than any official report. The cost of challenging the iron law was too high, and the system ensured that its secrets remained buried in the memories of the men who served it. Part 6. The Scratches of Cell D109, English. The retired guard had given me the unwritten rule, you never tell anyone about the screams. But to make the institution accountable, I needed the cold, hard walls of Alcatraz to confess the crime. My investigation led me directly to the place where the system's brutality was most absolute, D Block, the isolation unit. This was the wing where the iron law was applied with chilling efficiency, the place designed to contain and break the human spirit. I secured access, and walking through those silent concrete corridors was a terrifying experience. The silence here was different from the silence of the archives. It was a heavy, oppressive stillness, a silence that felt actively enforced. I located the cell I believed belonged to Subject 734, the inmate whose life was erased by a fraudulent transfer order. Maximum security cells are designed to be immutable, resistant to the desperate acts of the inmates they contain. Yet when I entered the small, damp concrete box, I was immediately confronted by a profound physical paradox. The cell was officially empty, whitewashed, and declared clean for decades. But when I ran my hands along the back wall, I felt them. Deep, ragged, vertical scratch marks. These weren't the shallow, random carvings of boredom. These were gouges etched deep into the hard concrete spanning from floor to ceiling. They were clear evidence of sustained, desperate, frantic effort, the physical scream of a man trying to claw his way through the wall, or perhaps simply leaving an indelible record of his final, terrifying moments. The existence of those scratches was physically impossible given the official narrative. How could an inmate in the most secure cell in America inflict that level of damage without a guard intervening, without the sound of stone scraping stone being recorded, and without the damage being repaired before the cell was certified clean? The scratches proved two things. First, the inmate experienced intense, sustained terror that drove him beyond the limits of self-preservation. And second, the institutional oversight had failed entirely. The guards had either chosen to ignore the hours of desperate noise, thereby confirming the seventh rule of silence, Part 5, or the prisoner was left completely alone to suffer in the absolute darkness of isolation, allowing him to carve his final silent testament into the concrete. I photographed the marks meticulously, viewing them as the unerasable physical evidence that validated the desperate shriek I had heard on the audio tape. Part 1. The wall itself had recorded the trauma. The scratches were a literal manifestation of the psychological torment, a desperate attempt by Subject 734 to escape the confinement that was driving him mad. This physical evidence was the Bang Chung Ko Hiu, the proof that the simple lie of the transfer could not survive the material truth of the cell wall. The scratches were the most truthful record of the prison's brutality, the one piece of evidence the system could not cover up with paperwork or silence. I realized that the cell walls, the hardest structural element of Alcatraz, held the most delicate, most truthful record of the inmate's final moments. The institutional cover-up had been robust, but they had failed to account for the physical impulse of a man facing oblivion. The terrifying finality of the isolation unit was captured in those deep, precise gouges, a desperate physical act of rebellion against a system designed to crush both body and spirit. The agonizing gouges in the concrete of cell D109 were the physical scream the system tried to silence. But to truly break the case, I knew I needed the prison's own psychological code. I left the cell, feeling the weight of that silent, desperate terror, and returned to the archives, determined to synthesize the fragments of the conspiracy. The scratches, Part 6, proved the struggle was real, but I needed the institution's language to understand the cover-up. The ultimate turning point occurred when I finally connected three disparate pieces of evidence: the chilling audio of the unheard scream, Part 1, the cryptic whisper from the retired guard, Part 5, and the physical evidence of the struggle in D Block. These three facts converged into a single terrifying institutional mandate. I reviewed the retired guard's testimony. He had given me the rule in pieces through his fear-encoded language, admitting only that you never tell anyone about the screams. I took that phrase and applied it to the physical reality of the prison. The screams were real, the audio. The screams were ignored, the lack of official report. The screams were contained, the scratches in the soundproof hole. The psychological horror wasn't random. It was governed by an enforced policy of institutional silence. I finally defined the terrifying, unwritten law that protected the prison's darkest acts. The seventh rule: never tell anyone about the screams. This was the true, chilling revelation. This rule was not about security from the outside. It was about protecting the institution from the inside. It was the mechanism the guards used to manage the psychological fallout of the isolation cells. The isolation unit was designed to break the minds of volatile inmates like Subject 734. But when that psychological pressure led to predictable suicide, death, or severe abuse, the seventh rule ensured the liability vanished. The discovery of this rule transformed my entire perspective on Alcatraz. I realized the prison operated on two parallel sets of laws: the official, published rules for public consumption, and the hidden, brutal rules for the system's self-preservation. The seventh rule was a silent contract among the staff. See the abuse, hear the suffering, but prioritize the reputation of the rock. This guaranteed that when Subject 734's life ended in his cell, the institutional response was immediate silent erasure, the fraudulent transfer. Part 3, the turning point, was complete. I now held the key to the cover-up. The systemic, calculated sadism of the prison was not accidental. It was protected by an unofficial mandate. By uncovering the seventh rule, I had found the emotional and procedural truth of the crime, confirming that the screams were not those of a ghost, but the echoes of pure, state-sanctioned human horror. My personal burden instantly magnified. I now held the absolute proof of the system's calculated brutality, a fact that made me a direct threat to the power structure that had so successfully maintained its silence for decades. Finding the seventh rule, the chilling, unwritten mandate that protected systematic abuse, was my victory. The system's immediate, precise retaliation was my defeat. I left that cold, empty cell, no longer an objective historian researching the past, but a man holding a volatile, present-day secret that directly indicted a branch of the federal government. My immediate action was to synthesize the evidence: the verified audio of the scream, the fragmented transfer records of Subject 734, and the definitive testimony of the retired guard, now backed by the understanding of the institutional code. I had the truth, but the moment I formalized my findings, the system responded with a terrifying, silent efficiency. The retaliation was insidious, rooted entirely in bureaucracy, not violence. It began with stonewalling. Access to the archives I had meticulously explored for months was suddenly denied. My requests were returned with vague references to reclassification, sensitive files, and ongoing internal review. The key historical documents I had yet to photograph, the daily duty rosters, the internal maintenance reports that might have pinpointed the precise time of the whole cleanup, vanished into the legal black hole of governmental secrecy. Phone calls went unreturned, and the few historical consultants who had assisted my research suddenly became unavailable. Their voices, polite but distant, clearly warned away from my inquiries. I realized the vast silent machinery of the state was working to contain me. The personal crisis I faced was profound. I had successfully uncovered the system's systematic cruelty, but in doing so, I had become the new Subject 734, a problem the institution needed to contain, marginalize, and ultimately discredit. The realization was chilling. My reputation, my funding, and my ability to access any official records were now hostages to the system's primary rule of self-preservation. I began to experience the same psychological pressure that had defined the inmate's life. Part 2. I looked over my shoulder in crowded streets, questioned every unanswered phone call, and fought the growing paranoia that my computer and files were compromised. The physical confinement of Alcatraz had been replaced by the psychological confinement of institutional silence. The ultimate moral and professional burden was the dilemma of the evidence. I possessed the audio tape and the photographic proof of the scratches, the evidence of the crime, but releasing it immediately and without context risked professional suicide. The institution could easily dismiss me as a sensationalist, a fringe theorist, using its immense resources to bury the complex truth under a wave of plausible denial. The only way to win was to be surgically precise, yet the very act of preparing my case placed me under continuous, severe threat. I fought the urge to simply walk away, to drop the files and let the cold case return to the silence of the archives. But the memory of that solitary, terrifying scream, the unheard plea for justice, forced me to continue, transforming the investigation into a personal, desperate commitment to expose the terrifying mechanism of institutionalized horror. The crisis was not external. It was the intense, suffocating pressure of holding a secret that the government had killed to keep buried. The system tried to bury me with paperwork, but the evidence spoke a clearer language. The terror of Alcatraz was not random. It was organized sadism protected by policy. I fought the bureaucratic siege, battling the denial of access and the growing sense of institutional paranoia, Part 8, knowing that the final answer was locked in the purpose of the 7th rule. The rule, never tell anyone about the screams, was not merely a suggestion for guards. It was the mechanism of silence designed to insulate the prison from accountability for its deepest cruelties. My analysis shifted from proving the murder to proving the system's motive for hiding it. I reviewed every fragment of evidence, realizing the crime was fundamentally about power and liability. Alcatraz, in its quest for maximum control, frequently used the isolation unit D-block as an experimental tool. The psychological purpose of the whole was to inflict sensory deprivation, breaking the volatile spirits of men like Subject 734. This extreme environment, however, produced unpredictable and violent consequences, including psychosis, self-mutilation, and inevitably death. The institution quickly realized that its own tool for control, the whole, was a massive source of legal liability. If an inmate died or suffered irreversible psychological damage within those dark, silent walls, the outside world would demand accountability, shattering the prison's image of professionalism. The 7th rule was the institutional solution to this liability crisis. It functioned as an unofficial mandate for the guards. Abuse the inmate in D-block as necessary to enforce obedience, but ensure that any evidence of that abuse, the screams, the sounds of struggle, or the death itself, never breached the walls. The rule granted the guards and the prison administration absolute power within the isolation unit, securing a private sphere where cruelty was unchecked. Subject 734 was likely a victim of this systemic sadism, driven by the intense isolation and unchecked physical force to the point of collapse. Part 6. The scream I heard on the tape was the final, tragic piece of audio evidence that confirmed the brutality, proving the institutional environment was actively designed to facilitate and conceal harm. The immediate creation of the fraudulent transfer file, Part 3, was the logical conclusion of this internal rule. The moment Subject 734 died, whether by intentional violence or neglect amplified by isolation, the official imperative was to make the death appear to have happened outside the prison's walls. The transfer order was the bureaucratic mechanism that washed the system's hands of the blood, making the victim a legal ghost who was no longer the prison's problem. The psychological horror of Alcatraz was not that guards killed men. It was that the entire system was designed to allow the abuse to happen and then provide the perfect, untouchable paper trail to cover the crime. The true motive for the cover-up was not high-level political conspiracy, but the mundane, cold efficiency of systemic self-preservation against liability. The system had established its motive for murder, the defense of its own procedural and psychological cruelty, but to achieve final victory, it needed one last perfect accomplice, the freezing, deep currents of the San Francisco Bay. I knew that the execution of the prisoner was only the penultimate act. The final crucial step in the conspiracy was the absolute total disposal of the body. The institution had a motive for murder, but the Bay delivered the final verdict. The meticulous mechanism of silence I uncovered, Part 9, demanded that Subject 734 not just die, but completely vanish. My investigation led me to conclude that the death was immediately followed by a systematic, brutal cleanup operation, likely executed by the very guards who enforced the seventh rule, Part 7. The body was removed from the confines of the cell, Part 6, and brought to the desolate, inaccessible edge of the island. The currents and cold waters of the bay served as the perfect, non-traceable grave. The prison's location, its greatest strength against escape, became its greatest strength in hiding the crime. The lack of corpus delicti, the body, was the single fatal flaw in my entire case. The killers knew, with cold certainty, that the combination of tidal power, deep water, and the natural predators of the sea guaranteed the evidence would never resurface. The ocean was the system's perfect defense attorney. I faced an immediate, paralyzing legal truth. I could prove systemic motive. I could prove abuse, I could prove a transfer was fraudulent, but I could not prove murder without the physical body. Despite possessing the audio tape, the scream, Part 1, the scratches on the cell wall, the physical struggle, and the guard's testimony, the unwritten rule, Part 5, the legal system ultimately defaulted to the safest, most convenient lie. The case was formally closed as missing, presumed drowned. My meticulous reconstruction of the crime, the psychological collapse, the hurried removal of the body, the immediate erasure of the paper trail, was strong enough to convince me, but it was insufficient to overcome the burden of proof required by the state. The institutional narrative established immediately after the disappearance, Part 4, 1. The price paid was the death of justice. The prison system, by utilizing the powerful geographical features of Alcatraz, successfully protected its flawless record. The cover-up succeeded because the evidence was not destroyed by fire or shredding. It was dispersed by the powerful cold currents of the bay. The ultimate crushing realization was that the institution's victory was absolute and final. The truth was locked on the island and in my archives, but it was legally useless. I had solved the crime, but I had failed to deliver justice. The legal system delivered its verdict: missing, presumed drowned. But the public, sensing the massive institutional lie behind the closed files, demanded a more terrifying, more visceral explanation for the horror that occurred on the rock. I realized the true legacy of Alcatraz is not its strength as a fortress, but the psychological scar it left on the national consciousness, transforming the site of bureaucratic murder into a symbol of the supernatural. The public needed an explanation for the profound, unnatural silence, and they found it in the concept of a haunting. The psychological transfer was instantaneous and absolute. The unexplainable physical evidence, the sudden disappearance, the lack of struggle, and the pervasive coldness of the cells, was converted into a spiritual narrative. The screams I heard on the archived tape, Part 1, were not truly silenced. They were psychologically transferred onto the very walls of the prison. The public began to report hearing ghostly cries, unexplained noises, and the heavy clanging of cell doors when no one was near. These sounds were not spectral events. They were the institutional memory of the suffering inflicted under the seventh rule, Part 7. The cold, damp concrete structure became the perfect repository for human agony, and the myth that emerged provided a comforting escape from the difficult truth. It is easier for the human mind to accept a ghost that can be exorcised than to accept the cold, permanent reality that a government system actively murdered and erased a prisoner to protect its reputation. I have walked those cold corridors when the fog rolled in, making the prison feel small, isolated, and oppressive. I can attest to the atmosphere of profound dread. But the terror I felt was not from the spirit world. It was from the knowledge of what humanity had inflicted there. The true haunting of Alcatraz is the echo in the walls, the permanent psychological residue of systematic abuse, unchecked power, and the conscious destruction of the human spirit. The cells themselves, especially those in D Block where the terror of isolation was perfected, carry the psychological weight of the men who screamed their final moments into the concrete. Part 6. The enduring legacy is the transfer of guilt. By labeling the prison haunted, the American public could externalize the shame and institutional guilt associated with the torture and erasure of men like Subject 34. The haunting became a psychological shield, protecting society from the terrifying truth that the system designed to punish crime was equally capable of committing it with absolute impunity. The supernatural myth became the only way the public could acknowledge the immense, terrifying violence that occurred inside those walls without having to confront the failure of their own government. My burden, as the investigator who holds the factual proof of the cover-up, Part 3, 5-7, is to stand witness to both the truth and the profitable lie. I solved the crime, but the myth won the battle for history. The legacy of Alcatraz is the chilling, permanent reminder that the greatest terror is not what stalks us from the shadows, but what we, as an organized society, are capable of inflicting upon the most vulnerable, and the efficiency with which we bury the truth afterward. The echo in the walls is the ultimate testament to the price of silence. The legal files are closed, the prison is now a museum, and the American public has settled on a comfortable lie that the terror of Alcatraz was spiritual, a classic haunting. My investigation, however, leads to one definitive, harrowing conclusion that is far more terrifying than any ghost story. The ultimate legacy of the Rock is not the myth. It's the chilling indictment of human power and the sheer efficiency of institutional evil. The horror I uncovered was not supernatural. It was systemic. The fate of Subject 734, the inmate whose scream I found recorded on tape, was the inevitable consequence of a system that prioritized its flawless reputation over the sanctity of human life. The final verdict I deliver is that the crime was entirely predictable. The psychological structure of the isolation unit, D Block, was an unmonitored laboratory designed to push men to the edge of sanity. The prison's most fundamental failure was believing that isolation and total power would not lead to systemic abuse. The seventh rule, never tell anyone about the screams, was the ultimate mechanism of corporate self-preservation, protecting the system from liability for the torture and eventual death of a prisoner. Part 7-9. The silence of the institution became the final, irrefutable proof of its guilt. The crime's perfect status was cemented by the environment. The sea did not kill these men. The sea was the system's final accomplice. The powerful currents provided the perfect alibi, ensuring that the critical evidence, the body, would be dispersed and made unrecoverable. Part 10. The institutional lie won because the law could not prosecute a vast, indifferent ocean. The truth, however, remains etched in the walls and in the logbooks. The physical destruction of the man was preceded by the methodical destruction of his mind, a terror that was meticulously documented by the very institution that carried it out. My personal burden, as the investigator who holds the factual record, is to continuously fight the comforting lie that the public has embraced. The ghosts people claim to hear are not spirits. They are the echo in the walls, the institutional memory of human agony and suppressed truth. Part 11. The ultimate moral of Alcatraz is that the greatest terror is the unchecked power wielded by men who believe that their rules and their system are above the law. My job is to ensure that the unshakable truth I found, the rule of absolute control, is recorded in history, even if the system fought me every step of the way. The investigation into the Rock's silence is over, but the lesson remains absolute. The true horror is not what the sea hides. It is the truth of what we are capable of creating in isolation. The final question I leave you with is this: are you comfortable knowing that the greatest source of fear is not the killer in the dark, But the power structure designed to catch him? Let me know your final thoughts on the system's complicity and the terrifying meaning of the seventh rule in the comments below. If you dare to continue this exploration into institutional horror and the boundaries of human endurance, make sure you hit that subscribe button. The truth, once revealed, cannot be contained.